The thunderous crack of a gunshot split the morning air, but Tessa Blackburn didn't even flinch. While the men crowding around Pritchard's general store scattered for cover, she calmly finished tying her dappled mare to the hitching post. Another day, another gunfight in Monticello, Utah Territory, 1876, a place where law and order remained more suggestion than rule. "That's Jim Walters and Frank Dennison at it again," the store owner called from his doorway. "Better stay put, Miss Blackburn." Tessa straightened her riding skirt, ignoring both his warning and the faded wanted poster tacked beside the entrance that bore her father's likeness. "I have business to attend to, Mr. Pritchard. Those fools can shoot each other all they like." Inside, she handed over her carefully written list. Flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, essentials for a woman living alone on the edge of civilization. Her father's ranch sat 15 miles outside town, and since his death 3 months ago, she'd been running it single-handedly, much to the dismay of the townsfolk who believed a woman belonged in someone else's kitchen. "Your daddy's property getting a bit much for you to handle alone, Miss Blackburn?" Pritchard asked while weighing sugar. "Folks been talking about Sheriff Miller looking to court you." "Fine man, respectable position, the ranch isn't for sale, and neither am I," Tessa replied coolly, placing coins on the counter. "And you can tell folks that Sheriff Miller would sooner marry his horse than get a proposal past my doorstep." The shopkeeper shook his head. "A woman needs protection out here. Your father understood that." "My father taught me to shoot straight and think for myself. That's all the protection I need." Before Pritchard could respond, the store's bell jangled. A tall stranger entered, trail dust coating his dark clothes. His face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed black hat, bore several days' growth of beard, but his startlingly blue eyes remained alert, taking in everything at once. "Afternoon," he nodded to them both. Pritchard's demeanor changed instantly. "Mr. Lancaster. Wasn't expecting you back so soon." The stranger Lancaster gave a slight shrug. "Job finished earlier than planned." Tessa gathered her purchases, uninterested in another drifter passing through. Monticello saw plenty of them cowboys, bounty hunters, and outlaws, all cut from similar cloth in her estimation. As she turned to leave, Lancaster stepped aside, but his gaze lingered on her face longer than propriety allowed. Something in his expression made her pause. "Miss Blackburn, isn't it?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of Texas drawl. She regarded him warily. "Have we met?" "No, madam, but your reputation precedes you." "And what reputation would that be, Mr. Lancaster?" she challenged, chin tilting upward. A smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. "The woman who turned down 3 marriage proposals in 1 month and threatened to shoot the last suitor who wouldn't take no for an answer." Pritchard coughed uncomfortably behind the counter. "If that's all you've heard, then the gossips in this town are being uncharacteristically kind," Tessa replied. "Good day, gentlemen." Outside, she secured her purchases to the saddle, aware of the stranger watching from the store window. Something about him unsettled her, not fear exactly, but a strange awareness that hadn't troubled her before. She mounted her horse with practiced ease, and had just turned toward the trail home when 3 riders thundered into town, kicking up clouds of dust. Their horses were lathered, pushed hard from wherever they'd come. Trouble, her instincts warned. The lead rider spotted her and jerked his horse to a halt. "You there? Woman, where's the sheriff's office?" Tessa recognized their type immediately: bounty hunters, hardened men who tracked human prey for money. "End of the street beside the saloon," she answered curtly. The man squinted at her. "Say, ain't you Ben Blackburn's girl?" Her spine stiffened. "I'm Tessa Blackburn. Thought so." He grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Heard your pa died. Shame about them cattle rustlers." The false sympathy in his voice made her skin crawl. Ranch must be awful big for a little lady to manage. "I manage just fine," she said, gathering her reins. "I bet you do," he replied, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her wish for her rifle. "Name's Darby, Clint Darby. Me and the boys might come calling once our business is done." Before she could respond, the store door opened and Lancaster stepped out, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "Miss Blackburn," he called. "You forgot this." He held up a small package she knew wasn't hers. Darby's hand instinctively moved toward his holster. "Something wrong, gentlemen?" Lancaster asked, his tone friendly while his eyes conveyed something entirely different. Darby glanced between them, reassessing the situation. "No trouble, just making acquaintances." He nodded to his companions and they rode on toward the sheriff's office. When they were out of earshot, Tessa turned to Lancaster. "I didn't forget anything." "No," he agreed, pocketing the non-existent package. "But those men were looking for an excuse to follow you home. Clint Darby has a reputation for taking what isn't offered." She frowned. "I can handle myself." "I don't doubt it, Miss Blackburn." His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "But even the best shot needs sleep sometime." "And what makes you think I need your help, Mr. Lancaster?" "Zachary," he corrected. "Zachary Lancaster, and I didn't say you needed help. Just thought you might appreciate the warning about Darby." Tessa studied him, trying to place him in the usual categories of men she encountered and finding he didn't quite fit any of them. "Well, thank you for the warning, though unnecessary. Good day, Mr. Lancaster." She urged her mare forward, acutely aware of his gaze following her out of town. The encounter left her oddly disturbed. Most men in Monticello treated her as either a tragedy to be pitied or a prize to be claimed. Lancaster had done neither. The 15-mile ride home gave her plenty of time to think. The Lazy Bee Ranch had been her father's pride, nearly 2,000 acres of good grazing land with water rights to Recapture Creek. Ben Blackburn had built it from nothing, and in doing so had made enemies. When rustlers shot him during a midnight raid 3 months ago, most folks assumed Tessa would sell and move east to family. Instead, she buried her father, hired temporary hands for the branding season, and learned everything about cattle ranching that her father hadn't already taught her. The banker, Mr. Holloway, had given her 6 months before foreclosing, betting she'd fail. She'd proven him wrong by driving her herd to market herself, returning with enough money to pay off the mortgage entirely. The look on Holloway's face when she counted out the full amount had been worth every sleepless night and blistered hand. The ranch house came into view just as the sun began its descent, a sturdy 2-story structure of weathered timber and stone that her father had expanded 3 times over the years. Home. As she dismounted, a bark announced Buck's arrival, the cattle dog bounding from the barn to greet her. She knelt to ruffle his ears. "Any trouble, boy?" The dog's wagging tail suggested all was well, but Tessa performed her usual perimeter check anyway, rifle in hand. Since her father's murder, she'd learned never to take safety for granted. That night, as she sat on the porch watching darkness settle over the land, Tessa pulled out her father's old journal. The leather-bound book contained everything from cattle counts to weather predictions, but most valuable were his observations about people. Ben Blackburn had been an excellent judge of character. She found herself wondering what he would have made of Zachary Lancaster. 3 days later, Tessa drove the buckboard into town for more supplies. The spring cattle buying season was approaching, and she needed to restock before potential buyers arrived to inspect her herd. She parked in front of the bank, mentally rehearsing her proposal for expanding her grazing rights. Inside, she found Holloway in a heated discussion with none other than Zachary Lancaster. "Miss Blackburn," Holloway said, his tone cooler than the February air outside, "I'm in a meeting. Perhaps you could return later." "My business won't take long," she replied, nodding briefly to Lancaster, who tipped his hat in response. "Actually," Lancaster said, "we were just finishing up." He turned to Holloway. "I'll consider your offer, Mr. Holloway, but as I said, I'm not looking to settle just yet." The banker's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The property would be an excellent investment, Mr. Lancaster. Not many opportunities like this come along." Tessa's interest piqued. Holloway had been trying to consolidate land holdings in the valley for years. Her father had warned her the man would use any means to control the area's water rights. After Lancaster departed, Holloway reluctantly turned his attention to Tessa. "What can I do for you, Miss Blackburn?" "I'm interested in purchasing the Mitchell property that borders my east pasture," she said, laying out a map. "I understand it's in foreclosure." Holloway's expression soured. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The property already has a buyer." "Already?" Tessa frowned. "It only came available last week." "Business moves quickly, Miss Blackburn. Perhaps if you had a husband to help manage your affairs." She ignored the jab. "Who purchased it?" "That information is confidential. Now, if there's nothing else, there is." She stood her ground. "I'd like to discuss options for securing additional grazing rights for the summer season." The meeting went downhill from there. By the time Tessa left the bank, her temper was simmering dangerously close to boiling. She marched across to the general store, nearly colliding with Lancaster, who was exiting with supplies of his own. "Whoa there," he said, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "Everything all right, Miss Blackburn?" She pulled away, embarrassed by her carelessness. "Fine. Excuse me." "Holloway has that effect on people," he observed, falling into step beside her. "Man could sour fresh milk with just a glance." Despite herself, Tessa's lips quirked upward. "You seem to know a lot about the people here for someone passing through." "Who says I'm passing through?" She glanced at him sharply. "Aren't you?" Before he could answer, shouts erupted from the saloon across the street. Darby and his men stumbled out, clearly deep in their cups despite the early hour. "Well, look who it is," Darby called, spotting Tessa. "The little lady rancher." Lancaster stepped slightly in front of her, a move that both irritated and intrigued Tessa. She wasn't used to anyone attempting to shield her, especially not a stranger. "Afternoon, Darby," Lancaster said calmly. "Seems early to be that drunk." Darby's eyes narrowed. "Don't recall asking your opinion, Lancaster." He spat on the ground. "Heard you were looking for work. Didn't figure you for the type to hide behind a woman's skirts. And I didn't figure you for a man foolish enough to start trouble in broad daylight," Lancaster replied. "Yet here we are." Tension crackled between them. Tessa noticed Lancaster's right hand hadn't moved closer to his gun, unusual restraint in a place where most men drew first and conversed later. "I don't need protection," she said quietly, stepping from behind him. Lancaster glanced at her, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Never thought you did." Darby laughed, the sound grating. "Two fools who deserve each other, the uppity widow and the gunslinger playing gentleman." He staggered forward. "Tell you what, Lancaster, I'll buy the woman off you. $5 for an hour of her time." The crude suggestion hung in the air for only a moment before Tessa drew the small derringer she kept in her pocket. "Mr. Darby, I suggest you apologize before I decide your kneecap isn't worth preserving." Several bystanders who had gathered to watch the confrontation backed away. Darby's face darkened with rage and embarrassment. "You threatening me, woman?" "Not threatening. Promising." Lancaster hadn't moved, but something in his posture had changed a coiled readiness that suggested he could draw and fire before Darby's alcohol-dulled reflexes could respond. Sheriff Miller chose that moment to intervene, his heavy footsteps announcing his arrival. "That's enough excitement for one day," he called out. "Darby, you and your boys head back inside or ride out. Don't much care which." Darby glared but backed down. "This ain't finished," he muttered before retreating into the saloon with his companions. The sheriff turned to Tessa. "Miss Blackburn, pulling a gun in the middle of town isn't helping your reputation none." "My reputation isn't my primary concern, Sheriff." "Maybe it should be," Miller replied. "A woman alone is still subject to the same laws as everyone else," Lancaster interrupted smoothly. "Miss Blackburn was merely defending herself from unwarranted advances. I witnessed the whole thing." Miller assessed Lancaster with the wary respect one predator gives another. "You planning to stay in our town long, Lancaster?" "Haven't decided yet." He nodded toward the saloon. "You might want to keep an eye on Darby. Men like that don't take humiliation well." After the sheriff departed, Tessa found herself alone with Lancaster again. "I didn't ask you to speak for me," she said, tucking the derringer away. "No, you didn't." He smiled slightly. "But the sheriff was more likely to listen to me, unfair as that is." She couldn't argue with his assessment. "Thank you," she conceded reluctantly, "though I would have handled it by shooting Darby's kneecap off, if necessary." Lancaster laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his weathered face. "I believe you would." He glanced at the sky. "Looks like rain's coming. Let me help you load your supplies before it hits." Before she could protest, he was already heading toward Pritchard's store. Tessa followed, puzzled by his persistence and her own reluctance to send him on his way. True to Lancaster's prediction, heavy clouds rolled in by late afternoon. Tessa hurried the buckboard along the muddy trail, hoping to reach the ranch before the downpour began in earnest. She was still 5 miles out when the skies opened. Within minutes, she was drenched, the road turning treacherous beneath the wagon wheels. A particularly deep rut caught the front wheel, and the sickening crack of breaking wood confirmed her worst fear: a broken axle, miles from home in a worsening storm. "Perfect," she muttered, pulling her sodden coat tighter. The horse shifted nervously as thunder rumbled overhead. Tessa climbed down to assess the damage. The axle had split clean through. There would be no repairing it here. She had 2 options: unhitch the horse and ride home, returning tomorrow for the wagon and supplies, or seek shelter nearby until the storm passed. The decision was made for her when lightning struck a tree not 50 yards away, sending her horse into a panic. Before she could grab the reins, the animal bolted, dragging the damaged wagon several yards before breaking free completely. Tessa watched helplessly as her horse disappeared into the rain. She was calculating her chances of walking home in the deluge when hoofbeats approached from the direction of town. A rider emerged from the gray curtain of rain, and even before he drew close enough to recognize, she knew it was Lancaster. He reined in beside her. "Miss Blackburn, are you hurt?" "Just wet," she called over the storm. "Broken axle and my horse spooked." Without hesitation, he dismounted and offered his hand. "Come on. There's a line shack about a mile east of here. We can wait out the storm." Pride warred with practicality as the rain intensified. "My supplies will come back for them," he insisted. "Right now, you need to get dry before you catch your death." Reluctantly, Tessa took his hand and allowed him to help her onto his horse. He swung up behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around for the reins. In any other circumstance, she would have objected to such proximity, but the combination of cold rain and exhaustion dampened her usual independence. The line shack proved to be a simple one-room structure, weather-tight and stocked with basic provisions clearly maintained for just such emergencies. Lancaster had her wait under the small porch overhang while he checked the interior. "All clear," he announced, holding the door. "Previous occupants left firewood, thankfully." Inside was sparse but clean. A small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Lancaster immediately set to building a fire while Tessa stood dripping on the plank floor, suddenly self-conscious. "There's a blanket on the shelf," he said without looking up. "You should get out of those wet clothes." "And wear what exactly?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced up, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "The blanket, Miss Blackburn. I'll step outside while you change." True to his word, he exited once the fire was crackling. Tessa quickly stripped off her sodden garments, hanging them near the stove to dry. Wrapped in the rough wool blanket, she called for him to return. Lancaster entered, carrying an armload of additional firewood. His own clothes were drenched, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He added wood to the stove, then rummaged through a trunk in the corner, producing a faded flannel shirt and worn trousers. "Ranch hands keep spare clothes here," he explained. "I'll change outside." When he returned, he discarded his wet shirt and coat, wearing only the dry trousers and an undershirt that revealed muscled arms marked with old scars. He draped his wet things beside hers near the fire. An awkward silence fell between them, punctuated by the drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Tessa pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "How did you know where to find me?" she finally asked. "I didn't," he admitted. "I was heading to the Mitchell property when I saw your wagon tracks turning off the main road. Figured I'd make sure everything was all right." "The Mitchell property?" Her eyes narrowed. "You're the buyer," Lancaster nodded. "Holloway approached me about it last week." "So you are settling in Monticello," she said, trying to mask her surprise. "Thinking about it." He pulled a coffee tin from a shelf. "Been drifting a long while. Might be time to put down roots." As he prepared coffee on the stove, Tessa studied him with new interest. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Lancaster? Please call me Zachary." He stirred the pot thoughtfully. "I've done a bit of everything. Cowhand, trail boss, cavalry scout during the war. Recently, I've been hiring out my gun, but only for causes I believe in." "A gunfighter with principles," she remarked. "That's rare in these parts," he shrugged. "The war changed a lot of men, made some worse, some better. I'm just trying to land somewhere in the middle." The coffee boiled and he poured 2 tin cups, handing one to Tessa. Their fingers brushed, a brief contact that sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. "And you, Miss Blackburn?" he asked, settling into one of the chairs. "What made you decide to run a ranch alone when most women would have sold after their father's death?" "Most women haven't spent their entire lives learning the business," she replied. "My father didn't have sons, so he taught me everything he knew. The lazy bee is my legacy as much as it would have been any brother's. And no husband to share the burden." His question held curiosity rather than judgment. Tessa gave a short laugh. "I'm too strong-willed for a wife," she declared. "At least according to the last 3 men who proposed." Zachary studied her over the rim of his cup, his blue eyes intense. "That's exactly what I need," he said quietly. The words hung between them, unexpected and charged with meaning. Tessa felt her cheeks warm and looked away. "You don't even know me, Mr. Lancaster." "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're brave, independent, and competent, rare qualities in anyone, man or woman. I know you've earned the respect of your ranch hands, even if the townspeople don't understand you. And I know that Clint Darby is planning something that involves your land." The last statement jerked her attention back to him. "What do you mean?" Zachary set down his cup. I've been tracking Darby for several months. He works for a man named Victor Sloan, a cattle baron from Wyoming who's been systematically acquiring ranches throughout the territory, by fair means or foul. And you think he's after my land? Tessa asked, mind racing. I know he is. Sloan sent Darby to assess the situation after hearing about your father's death. When you didn't sell immediately, they started making other plans. He leaned forward. The attack on your father wasn't random rustlers, Miss Blackburn. It was Darby's men, acting on Sloane's orders. The revelation struck her like a physical blow. You're saying they murdered my father to get our land? It's Sloane's method. Create problems for ranchers rustling, damaged property, intimidation, then offer to buy them out when they're desperate. How do you know all this? Zachary's expression darkened. Because he did the same thing to my brother's ranch in Colorado. When Thomas refused to sell, they burned his house with his wife and daughter inside. By the time I arrived, it was too late. The pain in his voice was raw, making Tessa understand his motivation wasn't merely professional. I'm sorry, she said softly. I've been gathering evidence against Sloane for nearly a year, he continued. Darby is the key. He carries out Sloane's dirty work, but he's careless. Talks too much when he drinks. And the Mitchell property, she asked, how does that fit in? Strategic position. It borders your land and controls part of the water access. I bought it to prevent Sloane from using it against you. He met her gaze directly. I'm not your enemy, Tessa. I'm trying to help. The use of her given name should have offended her, but instead it felt right coming from his lips. Why me? Why not let them take my ranch and catch them in the act? Because too many innocent people have already lost everything to Sloane's greed. He hesitated. And because from the moment I heard about you, the woman who faced down rustlers and bankers alike, to keep her father's legacy alive, I knew you deserved better than to become another of Sloane's victims. The storm raged on outside, but within the small cabin, something shifted between them. Trust, fragile and new, began to take root. What do you propose we do? Tessa asked. Spring a trap, Zachary replied, but I'll need your help and your trust. As the night deepened, they formed a plan. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed clean world and an unexpected alliance. Tessa found her horse grazing peacefully a quarter-mile from the line shack. Together, they salvaged what they could from the wagon and made their way back to the Lazy Bee. The next 2 weeks saw Zachary becoming a fixture at the ranch. To anyone watching, it appeared he had been hired as a ranch hand, but in reality, he was preparing for Darby's inevitable move against Tessa. They set up a careful watch rotation, with Tessa's most trusted hands taking shifts to guard the perimeter. Zachary sent telegrams to contacts in neighboring towns, building evidence against Sloane while keeping an eye on Darby's movements in Monticello. During these weeks of preparation, Tessa found herself drawn to Zachary in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. His quiet competence, his respect for her authority on her own land, and his unwavering support of her independence were unlike anything she had experienced with other men. One evening, as they sat on the porch reviewing maps of the property, Zachary pointed out vulnerable areas along the North Ridge. His shoulder pressed against hers as they leaned over the documents, and Tessa became acutely aware of his proximity. "You've been out here nearly 2 weeks," she observed, trying to distract herself from the warmth of his body beside hers. "Don't you need to check on your own property?" He glanced at her, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Are you trying to get rid of me, Miss Blackburn?" "Not at all," she replied honestly. "Just wondering about your plans after this is resolved." Zachary was silent for a long moment. "I bought the Mitchell place with plans to start breeding horses," he finally said. "Good grazing, enough water, defensible position." "You've thought it through," she noted. "I've been drifting a long time, looking for something I lost or maybe something I never had." His voice dropped lower. "I thought catching Sloane would be enough, but lately I've been wondering if there might be more for me here." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. Tessa felt her heart quicken. "Zachary," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Tessa, I know you value your independence. I would never ask you to surrender that. But I also know that two people can be stronger together than apart without either losing themselves." Before she could respond, Buck's warning bark shattered the moment. They both tensed, immediately alert. The dog raced toward the north pasture, barking furiously. "It's starting," Zachary said, reaching for his rifle. "Ready," Tessa nodded, already moving toward the stable. "Just like we planned." Their strategy was simple but effective. Make Darby believe Tessa was alone and vulnerable, then catch him and his men in the act. Zachary would position himself in the barn with 2 ranch hands, while Tessa remained visible in the house. The remaining hands would circle behind once Darby's men made their move. Night fell, bringing with it a tense silence. Tessa moved about the house, deliberately lighting lamps in visible windows before extinguishing all but one in her father's study. There she waited, rifle across her lap, listening for any sound out of place. The attack came just after midnight, not with gunfire, but with stealth. Tessa heard the faint creak of the back door being forced open and footsteps moving carefully across the kitchen floor. She repositioned herself behind the heavy oak desk, aiming toward the study door. "That's far enough," she called when a shadow appeared in the doorway. "I've got a rifle trained on you and I don't miss." Darby's laugh preceded him into the room. Feisty, as they said. "I like that in a woman." "What do you want, Darby?" she demanded, though she already knew. "Just a business proposition, Miss Blackburn." He stepped fully into the lamplight, revealing a gun in his hand. "Mr. Sloane has taken an interest in your property. He's prepared to be very generous, 50% above market value." "Not interested," she replied coldly. "That's disappointing." He sighed theatrically. "See, Mr. Sloane doesn't take rejection well. Bad things tend to happen to folks who turn him down. Just ask your pa." "Oh, wait, you can't." His grin was malicious. "Terrible thing, dying alone like that." White-hot rage surged through Tessa. "You murdered my father. Business is business." Darby shrugged. "Now, we can do this the easy way. You sign the deed transfer I brought, or we can do this the hard way." He gestured toward the window. "My boys are already setting fire to your north barn. By morning, your cattle will be scattered, your buildings ash, and you'll be begging to sell." "There's a third option," came Zachary's voice from the doorway behind Darby. "You drop that gun, and maybe you live long enough to testify against Sloane." Darby whirled, firing wildly. Zachary ducked as the bullet splintered the doorframe. Tessa seized the opportunity, squeezing off a shot that caught Darby in the shoulder, sending his gun clattering to the floor outside. Gunfire erupted as Darby's men encountered Tessa's ranch hands. The skirmish was brief but intense. When silence finally fell, Tessa and Zachary emerged from the house to find 3 of Darby's men dead, 2 captured, and 1 escaped into the night. Darby himself sat bound and bleeding on the porch, cursing steadily while one of the hands bandaged his shoulder. "You'll never prove anything," he spat when Zachary approached. "Sloane's too powerful. Got judges and politicians in his pocket all over the territory." "Maybe," Zachary acknowledged. "But I've got sworn statements from 4 other ranchers who survived your visits, plus telegraph records showing Sloane's instructions to you. By the time I'm done, neither of you will see daylight for 20 years." Sheriff Miller arrived at dawn with a posse, having been alerted by one of Tessa's hands who rode to town immediately after the attack. His expression as he surveyed the scene mixed disbelief and reluctant admiration. "You two set this whole thing up?" he asked as deputies led the prisoners away. "We did what was necessary," Tessa replied. "These men murdered my father and planned to destroy my ranch." Miller shook his head. "Vigilante justice isn't the answer, Miss Blackburn. Neither is standing by while criminals operate freely," Zachary countered. "Everything was done in self-defense after they broke into Miss Blackburn's home and threatened her life. The days that followed brought a flurry of activity. Zachary rode to the territorial capital with Sheriff Miller and the prisoners, carrying evidence to present to the federal marshal. Sloan himself was arrested at his Wyoming ranch a week later. Tessa remained at the Lazy Bee, repairing damage and preparing for the spring cattle buyers who would arrive within the month. News of the confrontation spread quickly, and for once, the town gossip painted her in a favorable light, the brave rancher who helped bring down a criminal enterprise. When Zachary returned 2 weeks later, Tessa was inspecting fences in the east pasture. She spotted him riding toward her across the open range, his figure unmistakable even at a distance. Something fluttered in her chest at the sight of him, a feeling she had spent years denying but could no longer ignore. He dismounted near her, looking travel-worn but satisfied. "It's done. Sloan and Darby will stand trial next month. The marshal's confident they'll hang given the evidence." "Justice for my father," Tessa said softly, "and your family." "Yes." His expression grew thoughtful. "Though I've learned revenge doesn't heal what's broken. It just stops the breaking from continuing." They walked their horses side by side along the fence line, the spring sunshine warming the air around them. Neither spoke for several minutes, content in the comfortable silence they had developed. Finally, Zachary cleared his throat. "I should be heading to the Mitchell place. Got work to do if I'm going to have it ready for those horses I plan to bring in." Tessa's heart sank at his words, though she tried not to show it. "Of course, you must be anxious to get started." "I am." He stopped, turning to face her. "But there's something I need to ask you first." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The Mitchell property borders yours to the east," he began. "Good land, but it would be better combined with the Lazy Bee. More efficient operation, better use of water resources." "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Lancaster?" she asked, using his surname deliberately to maintain some emotional distance. "In part." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "But I'm also proposing something else. A partnership of equals, Tessa. Not just the ranches, though that makes good sense, but us, together." She stared at him, pulse quickening. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." He smiled slightly. "Though I know you're too strong-willed for a wife." "And you still want that?" she challenged. "That's exactly what I need," he said, echoing his words from the lined shack. "Someone who knows her own mind, who stands her ground, who fights for what matters. I don't want a woman who disappears into my shadow, Tessa. I want someone who walks beside me, who challenges me when I'm wrong, and who trusts me enough to be herself." The sincerity in his voice struck her deeply. Here was a man who saw her strength not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a quality to be valued. "It won't be easy," she warned. "I've been making my own decisions too long to change now." "I wouldn't want you to change," he replied, "and I expect you'll tell me plainly when I overstep." Despite herself, Tessa laughed. "That I will." Zachary took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "Is that a yes?" She studied him, this man who had come into her life unexpectedly and had shown her that independence didn't have to mean solitude. "Yes," she said finally, "but on one condition." "Name it." "We run both properties together, equal partners in everything." His smile widened. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Lazy Bee, with only a handful of trusted hands and the territorial judge in attendance. The town of Monticello buzzed with the news the strong-willed Blackburn woman had finally met her match in the quiet gunfighter who had helped bring down Victor Sloan. By fall, the combined Lancaster-Blackburn ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the territory. They expanded the cattle herd, and Zachary's eye for horseflesh proved valuable as they began breeding quality stock that drew buyers from as far as California. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Tessa leaned against Zachary's shoulder. "You remember what you said when we first met?" she asked. "About my reputation preceding me." "The 3 marriage proposals and the threatened shooting," he chuckled. "How could I forget?" "I was so determined to prove I didn't need anyone," she mused. "Especially not a husband, and now—" He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Tessa smiled, placing his hand over her stomach where their first child had just begun to make its presence known. "Now I know there's a difference between needing someone and choosing someone. I don't need you to survive, Zachary Lancaster, but I choose you to share my life." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice rough with emotion. "And I choose you, Tessa Lancaster, every single day." As darkness settled over the land they had fought for and now nurtured together, Tessa reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Her father had taught her to be strong, independent, and determined, qualities that had saved the ranch, and ultimately led her to the one man who valued those traits rather than seeking to diminish them. In the years that followed, the Lancaster-Blackburn ranch flourished, as did their family. They welcomed a son the following spring, naming him Benjamin after Tessa's father, and a daughter 2 years later. Their children grew up learning both cattle ranching and horse breeding, with Tessa and Zachary passing on not only their knowledge, but their values: courage, independence, and the understanding that true partnership strengthens rather than diminishes the individuals within it. The town of Monticello, Utah Territory, evolved as well, growing from a rough frontier settlement into a proper town with a school, church, and eventually a railroad spur that made getting cattle to market significantly easier. Tessa served on the town council for many years, while Zachary occasionally acted as deputy when the sheriff needed assistance. Victor Sloan and Clint Darby received justice for their crimes, though neither lived to serve their full sentences. Darby died in a prison fight 6 years into his term, while Sloan succumbed to consumption after just 8 years behind bars. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Zachary surprised Tessa with a special gift: her father's original homestead claim, beautifully framed alongside the expanded map of their property, which now encompassed over 5,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory. "From one small claim to all this," he remarked as they stood in his study surveying the map. "Your father would be proud of what you've built." "What we've built," she corrected, her hand finding his. At 45, Tessa's auburn hair now showed strands of silver, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes, but her spirit remained as fierce and independent as ever. Zachary, his own dark hair now liberally streaked with gray, pulled her close. "Never thought settling down would bring more adventure than all my years of drifting." "That's because you found the right partner," she replied with a smile. "Someone too strong-willed to let life grow dull." "Exactly what I needed," he agreed, echoing the words that had become something of a private motto between them over the years. Their children were nearly grown now, Benjamin preparing to take on more responsibility in the cattle operation, while their daughter Emma showed a remarkable talent for training horses. The legacy they had fought so hard to preserve would continue, shaped by new generations who understood that strength came in many forms, and that the most enduring partnerships were those built on mutual respect and trust. As the sun set on their 20th year together, Tessa and Zachary Lancaster stood side by side on the porch of the home they had defended and expanded, their hands intertwined as they watched the first stars appear in the vast Utah sky. The strong-willed woman and the principled gunslinger had found in each other not the surrender of their independence, but its fullest expression, the freedom to be entirely themselves, accepted and valued for exactly who they were. And in the end, that was the greatest adventure of all.